When I was still very young, I realized that my hometown, spelled Refugio in South Texas, once part of Greater Mexico, went by two different names, Refugio and Refugio, depending on who was speaking. So the gringos, or Anglo speakers, used the former pronunciation, while my parents, relatives, and other Latinos or Spanish speakers used the latter. And the two versions were not always mutually intelligible, forcing you to use the other when you were not being understood. Later, I grew up to realize that the world was not simply encoded with two different words for everything in it, but rather that some of us were operating in a bilingual, or at the very least, a code switching, a kind of Spanglish mindset. My parents spoke Spanish with each other and not with their friends, while my sister and I spoke English, but we understood both. It was not until 1964, when I started school, that I began to understand that language, much like the color of one's skin, one's faith, one's markers of identity, fit into a socially defined hierarchy of privilege, or at least they did in Refugio. In those times, you could be reprimanded or even sent home for speaking Spanish at school. Even though most of my classmates were also of Mexican heritage, I did not have a Latino teacher, someone with whom I could share an identity, until I was in high school. And even then only for PE. These early days of unspoken prejudice, racism, and identity played out for me largely in the background, like some kind of background noise or irritating sounds, static, disrupting the melody of your favorite song. I could ignore them, but I knew they were always there, and they were felt. Just being human in those days, in that town, and under those circumstances was not simply a matter of existence. Through my middle and high school days, I made some extra spending money by mowing the lawn and tending the rose bushes of Elliot and Louise Jocelyn, a couple who retired and moved across the street from us in Corpus Christi, where my family had moved in 1968. He was a Princeton grad, and she was from Vassar, but they had decided to live in South Texas for their retirement. They treated me with much more kindness and empathy than that usually given to a teenage gardener, and I learned a great deal from them. My ultimate decision to go to college in the Northeast was largely at their urging. When they suggested to me some colleges such as Williams, Haverford, Amherst, I approached my high school counselor, Mr. Souls, at Mary Carroll High School. And I'll never forget the words he spoke to me when I gave him my intentions about going to one of those schools. "Son," he said, like he was about to give a fatal diagnosis to me, "you're setting yourself up for failure. You people don't do very well in those kinds of schools. Go to Del Mar Community College and see if college is even right for you." I thanked him, went home, and applied for early admissions to Haverford College that very afternoon, and I got in. My sister and I were both first-geners, but a college education was of paramount importance for both my parents, always. My sister finished at Texas A&I University in Kingsville in 1976 when I left Texas for Haverford College. And it was there at Haverford that I learned the meaning of a word that was already shaping my future and character, serendipity. Serendipity, the occurrence and development of events by chance in a happy or beneficial way. It was serendipity that led me to ask the Jocelyn's if their lawn needed mowing. And it was serendipity and a lot of hard work that got me into Haverford. And yes, it was serendipity, in retrospect, that I would find myself, a first-gen Texas-born Mexican, taking Russian. So I'd placed out of Spanish already. I needed to take a second language to complete my requirements at Haverford. And by the time I was registering for classes, most sections of French and German and Latin were already full, but there were still seats left in Chinese and in Russian. So improbably, I found myself taking beginning Russian along with my courses in political science and chemistry and anthropology. And it was in taking these courses that I quickly discovered that these disparate disciplines inherently ask disparate questions as their primary mode of inquiry. So for example, chemistry would often ask the questions how and what, while anthropology asked where and who, and political science often asked what and where, among other questions. But it was my humanities courses in cultures and languages and world literatures, that all asked the question, why? Why is Horatio the only one left standing at the end of Hamlet? Why does Russian have no articles, the, a, an, in it? Why is vergüenza, a kind of mashup of shame and embarrassment, such an important part of performing Mexican identity? All of these themes had no single right answer to them, but all of them made for great conversations, discussions, with a lot of critical thinking, reading, and writing. I think of this critical approach to learning that the humanities offer as the H factor, the imperative to ask why and to question the situations and evidence that's placed in front of you. In my senior year, I cobbled together some scholarship money and funds to go to Leningrad for 6 weeks in the summer of 1979 to work on my Russian. And at age 20, this would be my very first trip abroad. Living in the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War challenged many long-established cultural and political stereotypes for me. Russia and Russians are our enemies. Russia's cold and unwelcoming. Russians hate all Americans. But it was in those first weeks of acclimation that I found this us versus them paradigm entirely counterproductive. And I came to realize that these preconceived attitudes were not different from the prejudice and racism that I'd encountered growing up in South Texas. As I listened, and I mean really listened to the stories and positions of my Soviet counterparts, I began to realize how many more answers and how much more understanding came from this kind of empathetic and humane interaction. After I returned from the USSR, I changed my major to Russian, and I've never looked back. I wound up taking a master's degree in Russian at neighboring Bryn Mawr College, and then another Russian master's at Harvard University before completing my doctorate in education at Harvard, where I focused on language acquisition and applied linguistics. In an ironic twist, in the summer between my bachelor's degree and my first master's in 1980, I taught English Lit at Del Mar Community College in Corpus Christi. When I returned to the USSR in 1986, this time for the academic year as a Fulbright Hays dissertation research scholar, I was researching why, there's that question again, why Soviet school students acquired such high levels of proficiency in English without any contact with native speakers of the language or with ever traveling to study the language. It was the Gorbachev era, a heady and unpredictable time of perestroika and glasnost. And as serendipity would have it, that atmosphere greatly facilitated my research. In this strange post-Chernobyl age of openness and relaxed position on foreigners in the country, I was granted unprecedented access to classes and students in Moscow schools. I was even the first graduate researcher ever given permission to bring video equipment into the country to record my work, something that had been forbidden until that time. I was not only allowed into classes to teach at several schools, but I was able to teach the American variant of English, which had been, before Gorbachev, banned from schools. Ultimately, I was asked to join a writing team to author the first Soviet-American collaborative textbook of American English for Russian students ever produced. The result was Breakthrough, American English for Speakers of Russian, published in Moscow in 1993. Observing and teaching classes in Soviet schools that year and further debunked my cultural stereotypes as I conducted my research. And I got to know the teachers and the students and even the administrators in more than a dozen schools. Through difficult conversations that most of our classes and our textbooks don't teach us to have, conversations that often lasted well into the evening, it became really easy to rethink the conventional wisdom that each of us held about the other. Our real enemy, it turned out, was not the red threat, but rather xenophobia, a profound yet baseless fear of the unknown or unfamiliar. This same approach I found would serve me very well in increasing my proficiency in Russian. I set a goal for myself that every day I would attempt a task in Russian that I'd never done before, from taking my clothes to the laundry and finding out that you could get a special scent for your bed sheets free of charge, to returning empty beverage bottles for a refund at a local repository, to getting rolls of Soviet film developed into photos. These seemingly domestic tasks challenged my grammatical, my lexical, and most importantly, my cultural knowledge of Russian and the Soviet Union, and over my 10-month stay, transformed both my Russian and me. The application of the H factor gradually increased my comfort in being uncomfortable and encouraged me to engage with the other, in this case, Russia and Russians, more authentically and productively. So after completing my dissertation, I took a position at the State Department at the Foreign Service Institute, supervising the language and culture training of our future diplomats, getting ready to work in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the former Soviet Union. It was a great gig. Lots of travel, meeting and working with interesting people in fascinating places, and all of it at an unprecedented time in world history. Once again, serendipity played into my life. As the Berlin Wall came down in 1987, followed by country-by-country bloodless revolutions in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and eventually the disintegration of the entire Soviet Union, everyone's perception of what was unchangeable in the world changed. Icons fell, paradigms shifted, and the global geopolitical landscape was transformed. Never before, at least not in my lifetime, had being able to ask the question, why, to think critically and to be empathetic to the human condition, been so valuable to understanding what was happening at the end of the 20th century. Our passion and training in the humanities served all of us especially well in those transformative moments. In the fall of 1990, the University of Texas at Austin invited me to join their faculty in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, and I was glad to return to my homeland after 14 years of living on the East Coast and more than a dozen trips to the Soviet Union and to Eastern Europe. For the last 35 years, I've dedicated my life and service to teaching University of Texas undergraduates how to ask and answer the question, why? Often in the context of learning Russian or a subject about Russia and the diverse people who reside there. From 1991 to 2020, my wife, who is also a professor here at UT in comparative literature, she and I took scores of our students and alumni to Russia during our summers, offering them opportunities to engage directly with their Russian counterparts and to have these difficult conversations, sometimes very substantive conversations with them. And then the COVID pandemic, followed by the invasion of Ukraine in 2020, ended my 45-year intense relationship with Russia. Last year, while I was at a conference in Montreal giving a paper on why reading Russian literature during the current war in Ukraine was more important than ever, I learned that my name had been included on the most recent list of sanctioned individuals no longer permitted to enter Russia for life. The first time in history that educators, professors had been included in such a list. This public declaration labeled me and other Russian scholars as anti-Russian propagandists. While many of my colleagues have been most supportive, calling my inclusion on this list a badge of honor, it's been my current students, Gen Zers with a lot of empathy and attitude that have shown concern and compassion in understanding how difficult it is to lose access to where one's passion lies. Just as I found my humanity in times of transformation and uncertainty in those 1980s, our current students are faced with navigating very precarious waters of changes and upheavals in our political, social, and cultural lives that often seem to be anything but humane. The transformation of Putin's Russia from the era of hope that I was able to witness at the end of the 1980s into the 90s into a totalitarian, authoritarian regime of corrupt oligarchs should be a cautionary tale for all of us today. Without the interrogation of inequitable and unjust regimes of power, we boldly ask the question, why? We all risk losing our agency and possibly our freedoms. Limits on free speech, the banning of books, attempts to undermine fair and equitable access to education, all of these threaten our collective ability to ask and answer why. I maintain an undying hope that if our civilization continues to include the study of the humanities, the H factor, as part of our public education, then you too will find that asking the question why is the first step in a greater interrogation of and resistance to unjust policies and practices. Whether understanding why divisive walls are dismantled as they were in Berlin or being erected as they are along the US-Mexican border today, asking why engenders power and powerful agency supported by critical thinking. By practicing empathy and compassion and by engaging in difficult and courageous conversations, the next generation of humans can ensure a much more humane future for us all. Thank you very much.